Welcome to this conversation. My name is Goulden. I've met you, most of you before, all of you before, who are watching this, my POV online space. Today, my background is in policing, and I spent 30 years in the police service, the last 10 years working with the Violence Reduction Unit in Scotland. And today, I'm going to introduce you to a good friend of mine, Kit Gruelle, who I met Kit back in, I think it was a few years ago in Iowa, when she was across working with a friend of mine, Alan Heisterkamp, and I was down to watch the film Private Violence, which was screening at a big auditorium in Iowa, and I'd watched that film, and I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago now, Kit, and it blew me away. It's one of these moments where it's been part of my journey. You've been part of my journey over the last few years, and I was desperate to get you, speaking on this platform to talk about the issues that I share a passion with yourself. So first of all, great to see you. Great to see you. Absolutely wonderful. I hear all your work in America and what's going on in your part of the world and around the world. We're all part of something big just now. We're all going through different issues. But could you introduce yourself? Tell us about what you do and why you do what you do. That's the bit for me. Why do you do what you do?
Well, I was lucky enough to survive a very violent marriage that ended with the death of my husband. I did not kill him. He was killed in an accident. But 3 weeks before Jack died, I tried to commit suicide because I'd gotten to a point that I couldn't take it anymore. But I took an overdose of pills, and then when the pills started to go to work, I was out in the garden when I took them, and I realized that the boys were going to be left with Jack for a father, and that was just unacceptable. And anyway, one thing led to another, and I took the boys and ran, and Jack left to go find work, and 11 days after he was hired in Louisiana, he was killed in an accident in the Gulf of Mexico. And when the call came in, and I mean, it's hard to think about. I felt responsible because I knew that it was going to take something like that happening for it to end. It was either going to take me dying or him dying. And you don't really actively pray for someone to die, but I knew that I kind of had to say to the universe, you're going to have to step in, or something's going to have to step in. And then all of a sudden, he was dead at the age of 29. And so it was a big load to carry around, because I thought for a while that it was my fault that he had died, even though he was 1,000 miles away when the accident happened. And I wound up leaving the mountains and going down to the Chapel Hill area and trying to kind of pick myself up and put the pieces back together that were just blown all to hell. And after a few years, I saw an ad to become an advocate for domestic violence victims in a local independent paper. And I thought, well, maybe I could do something to help, because I realized that there were very few people in my case that had helped by listening and validating, which I think are two of the most important things that have to happen for and with domestic violence victims. And one of them actually happened to be a police officer, or he was a deputy sheriff. And it's been 43 years since I interacted with him, but I'll never forget what he said to me. He believed me. He validated my experience. And so I got involved with working not only with victims of domestic abuse, but also trying to understand all the systems that they had to navigate. So the court system, the protective services system, and that sort of thing. I just sort of jumped into the deep end. And I've kind of been paddling around ever since. And I worked on a case here last year, and the DA asked me to calculate up how many victims I've worked with over the last 34 years, and it came out to between 36,000 and 40,000 women.
Wow. Yeah, and why do you do this? Why do you do this? You've talked about your experience. Why do you do this?
Well, it's interesting because I have both a macro and a micro reason. I feel like that the world would change if people were safe in their own homes. I think the basic concept of personal safety has just, maybe we've never had it. Maybe we've never ever had it. But I just see how women and children suffer when they're afraid in their own homes, and what that does to them on a sort of a molecular level.
Yeah.
And then the macro piece is, look what happens when children are exposed to domestic abuse or family trauma or whatever. I mean, there's a big conversation going on over here now with the book that Mary Trump has just released about the traumas that Donald Trump experienced as a child. And I want to say right off the bat, I'm in no way, shape, or form excusing anything that anyone does because they have experienced trauma. What I am saying is that I think that it's a formula that we need to be mindful of, and we need to connect the dots between what goes on behind closed doors in the name of family and in the name of love, and I'm putting love in air quotes, and how that plays out later on when these traumatized children grow up to become adults that perhaps crave and feel entitled to power.
Yeah, I think that's really relevant, Kit. You know, today in the UK, in London, our Youth Violence Commission launched their violence prevention report, which looked at how we, certain areas of focus that need to be taken, not just for the short term, but for the long term. And you highlight this violence behind the closed door, violence in the home. I often say violence, if we don't have violence, if we don't have peace in the home, we won't have peace in the streets. And
right.
I think, what's your thoughts on that? Why should violence reduction units here in the UK have a primary or have a focus on tackling domestic abuse in the home? Why would that be important for violence reduction units?
Well, part of it is what are children cutting their teeth on? Are they cutting their teeth on the notion that families are about mutual respect, about working together, about working collectively, about respecting one another, about making sure that even when things are bad, that everyone's still emotionally and physically safe? Or are we just going to, shut it out, and then later on, when it blows up in our faces, scratch our heads and say, well, how did this happen?
Yeah.
And for people like you and I, Graham, who have spent so much of our careers in that space where the violence is essentially private, you and I both know that at some point in time, in one way or another, it's going to rear its ugly head, and it's going to affect people in that family, and it's quite possibly going to affect people outside the home. And so I think for us, doing family and domestic abuse prevention work is not only a way to prevent the abuse that's going on within that family unit, but also potentially much, much, much larger crimes that are committed, like, for example, the Sutherland Springs, Texas church shooting, where the abuser went to the church and shot and killed 26 people. I mean, unfortunately, we have a lot of mass shootings in this country. And we almost always find out that there's a domestic violence component to it. And so for us, it's pretty frustrating because we're advocates. We listen to the stories of victims, and yet we routinely see the systems sort of say, oh, she's being hysterical, or she's exaggerating, or whatever. And then what she says is going to happen happens, and then again, everyone's sitting there scratching their heads and saying, well, how did this happen? So it's frustrating because I just think that if we focused on prevention, that we truly could prevent a lot of the chaos and the pain and the suffering and the destruction that all societies wind up dealing with.
Yeah, I think you made the point right at the start. We can help by listening, and that's what you've taught me. Since I watched that film, Private Violence, you taught me to listen to people's experiences, victims' experiences, women's experiences, children's experiences, and that's really guided me a lot. And that film, Private Violence, I've seen it many, many times. I've shown it here in the UK a few times, get good feedback. Why did you get involved in making of that film, and what messages were you hoping to communicate in that film?
Well, the film actually started out to be a history of the battered women's movement. but getting anyone to fund a film like that was next to impossible. And I first worked with a couple of filmmakers in California, and then the money kind of dried up, and I wound up finding Cynthia in North Carolina, and she just started kind of tagging along and going to court with me, and we went to shelter a few times, and we went to some different courtrooms, and her aperture was kind of expanded, so she started to understand the complexity of how our criminal justice system deals or does not deal with crimes committed against women and children. Yeah. And so she wanted to take it into a more kind of narrative approach. And I was still working at Family Violence and Rape Crisis, but also starting school up in the mountains at Appalachian. And Deanna's case just kind of fell in our laps because her primary advocate was a friend of mine. And she contacted me and sent me Deanna's photographs and said, the local prosecutor just wants to charge Robbie with misdemeanor assault on a female, which would have put Robbie behind bars possibly for 90 days for kidnapping her and beating her for 5 days and strangling her and, you know, just all this wretched stuff that she went through. But Stacy, Deanna's primary advocate, said, I think this is quite possibly a federal case because he crossed state lines with her. And it gave us an opportunity to allow the audience to kind of walk in Deanna's shoes as we go through that process, and the audience starts to understand that when they say to a woman, well, why don't you just leave? That's number one, a victim blaming statement. Number two, it's an ill-informed statement. And number three, it's a statement that lets abusers off the hook. And so Deanna's story kind of synthesized all that, and we were able to kind of follow it along with some other cases that were going on at the same time, to show the audience just exactly what it means to be a victim of domestic abuse in the United States. And then what does it mean when you pick up the phone and call 911? How do those dominoes go down? And so that's kind of how the film turned out, and I'm pleased at how it turned out.
Yeah, the film was the film Private Violence. That's the film we're talking about here. You know, Kit knows that the domestic abuse takes place everywhere. It takes place in workspaces, it takes place in the street, in the cars, on nights out, and as well as in the home. But it was what I found with that film was it put me in that person's shoes. That's what it did with me. It brought out the terror of the situation. And we talk about coercive control and just that. You know, you once told me many years ago about a case where it was just a perpetrator, a man bringing out a white towel from the bathroom, and that was enough. Right. I remember you telling me that, and that was enough to put that victim right back in place. If you say anything to the police, this is what's going to happen to you. Do you want to talk about that red flag? It was quite I remember you talked about that.
You know, it's interesting because I just did a hostage negotiations class 2 weeks ago outside of Sacramento. And one of the two officers who was involved in that case was there. And I haven't seen Tom for a long time. He's been retired from San Francisco PD for, I think, 10 years anyway. But he and his partner, Jeff, were two of the finest officers in the city of San Francisco for dealing with domestic abuse. And so I brought that story up with Tom because I hadn't seen him in so long, and I told him that I used that story so much in training. But essentially, what the story was they responded to a call, and Jeff was working with the victim, and Jeff had this way of really helping victims feel at ease, and so he had gotten and the victim obviously was way away from the abuser, and Tom was talking to the abuser. Well, what happened was Jeff had gotten her to kind of open up, and the abuser said he needed to use the bathroom. So he walked into the bathroom and he came out with a hand towel in his hand, and the victim immediately just kind of shut down. And Jeff was a smart enough cop that he realized that some sort of core dynamic had just changed. And so he got her further away, and he said, help me understand what just happened. And I think that's one of the critical questions that we all need to be asking victims is, help me understand. And she told him that whenever her husband would beat her, he would get one of the little hand towels in the bathroom, tie it around her face, and punch her face in. And so just with that one little gesture of walking out of the bathroom with a hand towel, that was enough to shut her down. And lots of other cops might not have had the insight that Jeff did to recognize that something had just happened that made her afraid. And so he followed up on it and was able to ascertain that hand towels for this victim meant something deeply significant.
Yeah, I think, you know, I've been involved in the past in training police officers to spot these subtle signs, you know, and I think, you know, that first bit of advice is just to be aware of the little things that might just shut down a victim. What else could, you know, I think I wasn't intending focusing on this, but let's go down this road. What other advice would you give to police officers attending domestic violence calls, domestic abuse calls here in the UK?
Well, one of the things that I've learned over the years is, and my brain works like this too, oftentimes when I'm listening to a victim, because I've been around law enforcement so much, I'm listening for crimes that have been committed. But because I'm a survivor and because I've been an advocate for so long, I also feel like it's important for us to give victims the chance to articulate what is the most devastating thing to them personally. And oftentimes, what's the most devastating thing to them has nothing to do with an arrestable offense. But it makes it so clear the complexities of domestic abuse. So, for example, a couple of years ago, a woman came into the agency I was working at, and she was homeless, living essentially in a cardboard box with her boyfriend behind one of our big box, like Home Depot or Lowe's, something like that. And he was pimping her out, and there were substance abuse issues and things like that. And he was raping her over and over and over again. And he was also prostituting her. And so in my brain, I'm thinking about all the criminal charges. And I sat cross-legged on the floor, and I make a point when I'm working with victims to try to sit below them and give them sort of the upper space. And so we talked for a long time, and she said that she still loved him. And I think part of it is that we have to understand that for so many victims, the trauma has started at a very, very early age. So traumatic bonding and traumatic relationships are what they're accustomed to. Yeah. And it's not our place to judge them for that. It's just our place to understand that that's kind of the building blocks of the way they see things. And so as we were winding down the conversation, I said, God, you know, you've been through so much. I said, what out of everything that you've experienced has been the most difficult for you? And I'll never forget it. She said, you know, the thing that hurts me the most is I still want us to make love, but he won't touch me unless I use hand sanitizer and wipe it all over my body and sanitize my body. Now, that's not something that cops could arrest him for, but for her, that was what cut most deeply. And she was devastated by that. And that was what made her cry. And that was what broke her down. And I just remember sitting there and thinking, man, did I get this wrong? You know, I was listening to all these horrific assaults that she's dealt with, all of which would have put him in prison for a very long time if a good investigation was done. But the thing that was the most hurtful to her was when he would make her sanitize herself before he would touch her. He would rape her, yeah. But he wouldn't. And so it just reminded me that if we really want to understand where victims are coming from, it's not up to us to frame their narrative. It's up to us to listen to their narrative and respect what has been the most difficult for them, what's been the most hurtful, and get law enforcement officers and social workers and anyone else who might be a first responder to understand that there might be a million facets to this relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a very fantastic description of you know, I used to, you know, tell police officers within the training we were delivering them was, you know, because police officers would often ask the question, what's happened here? Whereas we want them to be asking questions, how does it feel to be in this relationship? And I think when you start to ask that type of question, there's a chance to get all these other factors out that can be brought together to build the case. So, you know, in that first part of our conversation, Kit, you know, I really wanted to talk about the work that you do. You know, and I think that the work of victims advocates is incredible. You know, I remember in Iowa that time we met, you and I did a session working with advocates. And you know, what would your message be to domestic abuse advocates in this country today? What would your message be to them?
Listen, I mean, I just cannot overstate the importance. For one thing, victims are unaccustomed to being listened to, and then when they are heard, they are oftentimes still judged. Well, I wouldn't put up with that, or why don't you just leave? Or, you know, and it's like, my God, we've been answering the why don't you just leave question for 35 years. It's not the right question to ask. So my kind of advice, I don't like to say I'm giving advice, because I think we all come at this from our own sort of place of wanting to support victims, is to just to know that this is going to sound simplistic, but we're either going to be part of the problem or part of the solution. And what it means to be part of the solution is to listen respectfully, to not judge, to, when we hear the strengths the victims have, to point those strengths out to them. Because oftentimes women don't see themselves as strong and capable. They think that they're stupid and incompetent because that's what they're told. Yeah. So to have someone come into their world and listen for those strengths and say to them, when we hear something like that, like for an example, a long time ago, back when I first started this work, so way before there was caller ID, a woman called into the agency one day, and she was married to a man who was Pentecostal, which is one of the more kind of extreme religions over here. And her husband was very abusive. He was also in a wheelchair, so he was home most of the time. And when I was listening to her, she said, if you call my house and he answers the phone, tell him that you represent Women's Day and that my subscription is about to run out. And I said, God, that is so brilliant. And she stopped for a minute and she said, what? And I said, do you know how brilliant it is that you have figured out a way to keep the communication going in a way that's going to keep you safe? And so it's things like that, because what we give them in those moments, they will keep. So when their partner is busy telling them that they have no value, that they're stupid, that they're a terrible mode, that they're whatever, those little affirmations that we can give them, I think will help sustain them as they're trying to figure out the best way forward.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kit. I remember that day you talked about, you know, getting advocates to just to look after themselves as well, because they're being exposed on a daily basis to the terror of another person's terror. So thank you for sort of reaching out there. So I think that let's end that conversation just now. And I think when we come back next time, I want to explore our response, society's response. We've talked about police response. We've talked about victims advocates from organizations who are funded to give responses to domestic violence, domestic abuse victims. I want to talk about society, about the neighbours and the friends and the family. So thanks for that first conversation, Kit.